Hey everyone, this is one of those conversations that sits right at the intersection of everything I care about: the nervous system, the body, the mind, and the deeper meaning behind what we experience. Today, I'm talking with Denise Schonwald, who started her career as a critical care nurse and then moved into mental health counseling, and over time began to see something really important: that physical symptoms, emotional patterns, even the way we think, they're not separate, they're connected. And more than that, and more than that, they might actually be communicating something to us. In this conversation, we get into how the body holds emotion, the relationship between thoughts, physiology, and symptoms, why language matters more than we think, and how to begin looking at what you're experiencing not as something that's wrong, but as something that might be asking for your attention. We also talk about intuition, energy, and how to bring more holistic lens into clinical work in a way that still feels grounded and ethical. You will also hear me talk about how I am, quote, canceling the term mental health because of the way in which it potentially creates separation between our emotional, mental, and physical world. And so I'm really curious to hear from the audience, what do you think about that? What do you think about the term mental health? And does that, in your mind, create a separation between what we consider to be mental emotional health versus physical health? So if you've ever wondered whether symptoms, physical or emotional, might actually mean something, this one's for you. Let's get into it. Welcome to the Spiritually Curious Therapist, where science, spirit, and the self come together in the art of healing. I'm Jody Silverman, psychotherapist, Reiki master, and fellow seeker. Here we explore how presence, compassion, and nervous system wisdom helps us reconnect with the heart, the body, and the soul. Hello, and welcome back to the Spiritually Curious Therapist. Today, I am joined by Denise Schonwald, a nurse, mental health counselor, and author whose work bridges physical health, emotional healing, and spiritual awareness. We are going to explore the connection between mind, body, and spirit, and how physical symptoms can be messages pointing toward deeper healing. Denise is also the author of Healing Your Body by Mastering Your Mind, which explores healing through the chakra system. So welcome, Denise.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I am so excited for this conversation and the ways in which throughout your career you have put all of these different layers together in a way that really provides a holistic look at the individual and ways in which people can heal to their full potential. So I'm really curious, what led you from nursing into mental health counseling and then into seeing the mind, body, spirit connection? Like, how did you start pulling all of these things together?
I really loved being a critical care nurse. I used to call myself a body mechanic because after a while, when you've been nursing for years and years and people come in with an ache or a pain, it didn't take long to figure out about what's going on with them and what to do, particularly in critical care because they're usually very sick and you don't have a lot of time. But being an ICU nurse is definitely for the young. It's a lot of on call, it's a lot of heavy lifting, it's long hours. And I knew as I started to get older that I would have to bridge into do something else. But the big question was what? What's next for me? So I explored a couple things. I didn't really want to become a nurse practitioner because I felt like that was also going to be long hours in the hospital and so forth. And I met somebody who was going back to school to become a mental health counselor. And for me, it seemed like the perfect fit. Unfortunately, it was 5 more years. It was 3 years of schooling and 2 years as an internship. But I figured 5 years of my life would go by whether I did something about it or not. And I've never regretted it. It's been a great transition for me.
That's really amazing. So how far into your critical nursing career were you when you decided to make that switch?
Probably about 20 years.
Okay, yeah, so really long time.
Mhm.
I really love how you took what you were doing and looked for a way in which to do that that wouldn't necessarily create an added burden on to you.
Yes.
Because as you said, critical nursing is for the young, and I imagine that perhaps you started to feel maybe some burnout or some different ways in which you wanted to approach the work.
Yes, and certainly the long hours and on call. There were some nights where I would go in at 2 o'clock in the morning, get home at 4 a.m., get another call at 5:30, and after a while, it really becomes tiresome.
That makes so much sense. So I'm curious, given your time, those 20 years in working as a critical care nurse, I mean, one of the things that you mentioned in your book is that you found yourself actually loving that overnight shift because it meant you could spend time with the patients. And if I remember correctly, you love to like bathe the patients and just really have that quality time to get to know them and understand them better.
Yes, because that time usually everybody's gone home, it's very quiet. Maybe the family's there, maybe they've left, and you really get to sort of know patients on a deeper level and really have time to understand, their life and their history, which to me is fascinating. During the day, you're just taking care of and you're trying to hang drips and keep them alive, but during the nighttime was a really nice time to get closer to them and to learn them a little bit on a more personal level.
Yeah, and so was there a defining moment when you realized that physical symptoms hold a deeper meaning?
It's interesting that that's a great question because what happened was is when I went into psychology, I'm thinking, what am I supposed to do? Just listen to people's problems and say, "Oh, I'm sorry you feel that way." To me, I was like, how do I figure this out? How do I know? All of a sudden, I was listening to patients talk in the office as clients, and I realized that certain health problems and psychological problems sort of went hand in hand. And at the time, I was working with a psychiatrist, and I said, I've made this really interesting correlation. I said, certain patients that have this have that. And he said, you really should go back and study the chakras, which I had at that time, I had no idea what he was talking about. I didn't even know how to spell it. And I was like, okay, I'll go back and study the chakras. And so
Yeah.
that's when I really started to get into learn about energy and how different emotions are processed in different parts of the body. And then the light bulb went on. It all made sense to me.
Wow. So you actually had a psychiatrist tell you to go back and study the chakras.
Yes, and he's also a shaman. So he's like, you really have to go into energetically and understand how emotions affect our physical health. And I thought, wow, that makes sense. I just had no idea how to do it until I started to really study energy.
Wow, that is amazing. Talk about like having the right person at the right time in your life, because that could have been somebody else and they could have just poo-pooed it or just been like, oh, because our field for years, and it's only just now there are pioneers like yourself and the folks who listen to this podcast who really are starting to put all of those pieces together, that we're looking at a holistic person, mind, body, and
Mhm.
spirit, which
Yes.
includes the energy body as well. So the fact that you were working with a psychiatrist who was also a shaman who pointed you in this direction, I think is very synchronistic and just a wonderful thing. So given all of that and given all the work that you've done and your experiences, how do you understand the relationship between mind, body, and energy slash spirit in healing?
The spiritual part for me came in because when I was going through graduate school, we had to learn about all kinds of religions and because there's different ways of healing. And we also learned about shamanism, we learned about, and we had to understand that certain people, their faith will really help them go through problems and to learn and get wisdom and knowledge. So I thought, okay, I have to be open to understand that maybe it's not how I would believe or so forth, but I have to recognize and honor the way that other people are impacted. What I started to realize is when people have problems, depending upon what they are, obviously they come to a therapist for the problem, it has some sort of spiritual significance. The universe is trying to teach them something, maybe compassion, maybe to get out of a really bad situation. And although I wanted to help and guide, it, they had free will. So certainly sometimes they weren't ready to make any change. But then I also had to open that space up for healing through a way that would connect with them. And that can be really tough when you're sort of set in your own ways. So that really helped me to be more open-minded and understanding that people have different ways of healing and moving forward or not, because sometimes they're just not ready. And then we have to accept that too. That really helps me not burn out, to be honest with you.
Yeah, so the acceptance that people just might not be ready to hear what you have to
Correct.
share. Yeah. Yeah.
Correct.
So if I'm a clinician and I'm listening to you, or let's even say working with you, maybe I'm one of those people who's a little bit more, I won't say narrow-minded, but like focused on what we learn in our typical schooling. How can I start to broaden my way of thinking about things to be more holistic in my approach?
One of the questions that I ask when I first meet someone is, are you religious or are you a religious family? And if they say, no, I have no connection to religion whatsoever, I may throw in the word universe. And so
Mm,
what I say is, when we're experiencing problems, there's different areas of the body that the emotions are felt. For example, trust is felt in the stomach. And so I'll go with it a little bit more scientifically. And I say, listen, when we have problems and so forth, we actually feel them in our bodies. And if we ignore them, which many of us do, they will eventually manifest physically. So I help them sort of connect it, regardless of whether they have any sort of faith or belief system or not.
yeah, that's really helpful. And especially using the language that feels relevant to the person. And
Mhm.
I do that a lot too, depending on who's in my office, where I might use the word universe sometimes, especially if I'm working with folks who are in AA or some kind of program, I'll use higher power, or I might even ask what feels most comfortable for you. So I think that's super helpful. Okay, I'm hearing you say that one of the ways you open the door is to start to talk about how emotions are sensations that we feel in our body. And depending on what the emotion is, there are correlations or links to different areas in the body where it might be felt.
Correct.
And from reading your book and from what I know about the chakra system, I'm assuming that follows the chakra system.
Yes. So what happens when we struggle with an emotion? For example, guilt. So
Mhm.
maybe that's something that I grew up with, a lot of guilt, maybe I have religious guilt. That actually is felt or processed in the intestines, so over the bladder and so forth. So they likely have some sort of irritable bowel, stomach problems, and so forth. When we get on medication, because a lot of times when we go to the doctor, they give us medication for that, we have to remember how powerful the mind is. Because the mind can go over and supersede anything that the medication is trying to do. And so I really work with clients to help them go on a mind diet, to learn how to process different emotions differently. A lot of it's reframing and being very careful of, I call it dark thinking.
I love where you're going with this. Okay, so my experience in my training, especially most recently, is in pain reprocessing therapy, where we really are understanding the neuroscience in terms of how our brain can actually create symptoms in our body as a way of protecting us, especially when
Mhm.
we are under threat or we've experienced trauma. And the work there and the healing around that is to work with the brain on creating safety in the system. I always say to people, like, let's turn towards your thoughts, not necessarily because they're true, but because they're running a system underneath all of this. And we just want to know, what is it that your mind is saying to you? I'm just looking at the title of your book, Healing Your Body by Mastering Your Mind. Can you say more about how that then relates to the chakras and the energy system that then relates to the emotions and the physical symptoms? How do you put all of that together?
When an experience comes in into our being, it comes in with neutrality, and it's our perception of the experience that we hold, true or not true. So we have to remember the body is always being cued by the mind. So I may say something like, I know my neighbor across the street doesn't like me. And she might not even know who I am, but my body has to absorb those feelings. And of course, my body, hearing all that from the mind, will start to excrete epinephrine, cortisol, and so forth. And so what happens over time is the body really struggles to deal with the mind, whether the mind is healthy or not, because the body's always responding to it. I'm seeing children younger and younger getting sicker and sicker because all of a sudden their minds are so overstimulated and everything is a problem, or they feel guilty, or they don't feel good about themselves. And it's really wreaking havoc on the body.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I'm noticing a lot post-COVID as well, just in terms of the collective trauma that we all experience, both emotionally and socially, as well as whatever the virus may have done to our nervous systems and our
Mhm.
immune systems, which there's still a lot of research being done, but it seems to be showing up in all these different areas. And I hear what you're describing. The way that I talk about it is like a locked nervous system where your mind and your body is doing this dance of protection
Mhm.
where your mind is saying there's a threat, whatever that might be, whether it's the neighbor or the phone in your pocket that keeps dinging. I say to people, we may not be encountering lions out there in our environment, but we've got lions in our pockets now. So they're constantly creating hypervigilance in our system. And then the body responds, and then the mind responds to that, and then the body responds to that. And we're stuck in these loops of protection, which creates all this ease showing up in these physical symptoms. Do you see specific emotional themes showing up in these different areas of the body related to what might be going on in people's environment? As a helper or a healer, or even somebody who's out there in the world, what are some things I might be looking for?
It's very interesting to me when people describe their concerns. They would describe them to me as their fears or my biggest worry. So they're going in already with harsh language. And it's interesting to me how far ahead they get. Like, I better not travel because if I get COVID and then I go visit my grandmother and then she gets sick and she's in the hospital, everybody will blame me. And they haven't even gotten on the airplane yet.
Yeah.
And so a lot of times I'll slow them down and I'll say, well, is that true? Or do you feel like you're getting ahead of yourself? The mind will take that and just spin and ruminate. And then the mind starts to create all of this chaos. And I try to help them understand that the body is paying the price for that because the body is constantly in fight or flight. And so I try to slow down the language. I also try to get them to use a different word instead of, I'm going to confront this person. I'll say, well, how about you address your concerns? Instead of confronting to me sounds like I'm going in with knives and I'm going to hit somebody. Why don't we just address it? My biggest fear, okay, my concern is because concern is sits a lot better in the body because the body's like, oh, just a concern, not a fear. Worrying is something that we seem to be very attached to, but it's very harmful for the body, particularly the heart and the stomach.
Yeah, I love the reframing of the language. And I, even as you were saying that and you were giving alternatives, I could feel my nervous system relaxing around the new language. I'm going to confront versus address just feels different in the nervous system. Yeah, I really love that. So, along those same lines, in your experience, what else helps the body feel safe enough to release some of these long-held patterns? Because some of these things are maladaptive behavioral patterns, relational patterns that developed early in childhood as a way of keeping us safe, and over time create this level of dis-ease in our bodies. How do you help people start to recognize that, which is insight is wonderful, but
Mhm.
it's really physiological and energetic, and that takes a whole other way, a different level of work.
Not only that, but it becomes very familiar to us. So
Yes.
if we've grown up in a chaotic home and so forth, we don't feel normal or familiar if we're not in chaotic situations. So it can be a very hard pattern to break, very hard. Because what happens is when we go down there, particularly with anxiety is very low vibrational. And when we go in that space, we feel normal. So what people will typically do is work a lot. And you'll say, well, what are your hobbies? Oh, I don't have time for hobbies.
Mm.
What do you do for fun? Oh, I never have any free time. So they create their lives to adapt to this chronic stress situation. Trying to get people to take time for self-care is like pulling teeth. It's like, well, what do you do on your day off? Oh, I have to do laundry, I have to run errands. And I was like, why don't you get some help with that? No, 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 I wouldn't trust anybody. And it's like, okay, so it can become very challenging to get people to buy into doing something that will ultimately be very healthy and helpful for them.
Yeah, I find that as well. And, the anecdote to a locked system is to bring more safety in, and we bring more safety in by creating environments and situations in which we feel connected and we feel like we have choice and we feel curious. And that
Mhm.
often happens when we're doing something that's joyful versus something that we feel like we have to do. We feel like we have to do it or we should do it. That only reinforces that hypervigilance. And so helping people move to a space where they start to introduce hobbies and play and connection time into their lives is super important as an anecdote to having that locked system.
Yes, and they particularly fear stillness. That
Mm-hmm.
if I get still, that's when I start to get a lot of anxiety. So they're constantly doing something. So if I can get them to do something like paint or do some crafts or something like that, where they're doing something, but they're also being creative,
Yeah.
that can be helpful. But when they sit down, we all do, tend to pick up our phones and start scrolling because we don't like the idle time because we don't really want to think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's so habitual now. I mean, the
Mhm.
phones are just there. And we see it
Mhm.
happen all the time. People pick it up, they look at it, they put it down, and then 2 seconds later, they pick it up again. If we were just observing folks, it's pretty amazing. And then with the scrolling and the doom scrolling, it's a real, I think, health epidemic in our culture right now.
Yes, it's becoming our number one addiction
Yeah. Yeah. It's
behind
so
alcohol and smoking marijuana and gambling. It's the number one.
it's so accessible.
Mhm.
It's so accessible. So, how can therapists integrate this mind, body, and spiritual awareness in a grounded, ethical way? So, we're talking about chakras, we're talking about energy. A lot of therapists fear that, even though it might align with their own personal way of thinking and their belief system, they fear bringing that into the clinical arena because there historically has been like, oh, that's too woo-woo, or chakras don't really exist, or it's not evidence-based, whatever people might say about it. Let me ask this, how do you do that in a way that feels aligned to you?
Well, for me, understanding the energy systems in the body is science.
Mm,
Because when I first meet with someone, I ask about their physical health, I ask what kind of medications they're on. I ask probably about 10 questions. And by the time I've reached question 8 or 9, I already have a really good understanding of why they're there for mental health because I'm sort of putting a puzzle together. So for me, it's not like I'm just grasping at a little this and grasping at a little bit that, but I'm understanding how the body is handling situations and so forth and where it's sitting. Is it sitting in high blood pressure? Is it sitting in thyroid problems? How is it all connecting together? And for me, it's all scientific, but I'm also trying to get people to understand that different parts of the body will absorb the hit or the emotion. And in all my years, so now I'm in year 30 of either doing medicine or psychology, I've never had it not fit together.
I love the way you talk about it being all these different puzzle pieces because I operate that way too. Like, let's look at this and let's look at that. And we don't operate in these vacuums. I mean, as human beings, we are nature, and nature is self-organized. Everything has a
Mhm.
purpose. And when things happen, they don't just happen randomly. So just looking at it as a puzzle and like pulling those different pieces together to help people understand themselves better, I think can be really empowering for individuals who are trying to heal not only emotionally but physically as well. I'm on this new kick where I'm like canceling mental health because I think by separating mental health, physical health, emotional health, energetic health, like we're putting ourselves in these vacuums and looking at pieces of the elephant without looking at the whole picture. I really appreciate what you're sharing here. In
Mhm.
your book, you talk about being really intuitive.
Mhm.
And even as a child, if I remember correctly,
Yeah.
and how that has played a role not only in your nursing career, but of course in your now mental health career. Can you talk a little bit more about that? A lot of the folks who listen to the podcast are spiritually inclined or spiritually curious therapists. So, of course, they would be, but also have intuitive hits or are very sensitive to energy and, again, have some fear around using that as part of their toolbox.
When I was a little girl, my dad had bipolar depression. And when you're 5 and 6 years old, you don't understand what it is. Cognitively, you don't understand mental health problems and so forth. But I learned to be very perceptive to energy. When he would walk in, I could understand how he was feeling, and that was all perception.
Hmm.
And then when I grew up and went into nursing, I thought that perception thing is really helpful because I would go in to see a patient and they would look great on paper, but I would look at them and I was thinking, they look terrible. Like I don't like the color of their skin and what's going on with the family. So there was a lot of sensing, and I learned to sort of not discount how I was feeling about a situation or a patient or a different problem. So my mind would understand one thing, but I was really going into the body to feel and get a good sensation or understanding of what was happening. Then when I went into psychology, because I do also do a lot of couples, I realized that if we're not in good mental health, we will attract a partner that will match that.
Hmm.
So I've written also a book called Elephants Don't Marry Giraffes because these dynamics will start to evolve because we ourselves are not healthy. So then we'll attach to someone else who's not healthy. For me, it's all about intuition and perception, getting a sense of what's going on without really understanding what's going on, particularly when I first meet a couple.
Yeah, so really using your own internal experience to gauge
Mhm.
what's happening in the field.
Yes.
I think that's super important. And I think a lot of people, especially healers and helpers that have that gift, it's either been poo-pooed or they've had to put it aside because they've gotten the message that they're too sensitive or that they're overthinking things or whatever messages that people get who have that intuitive skill and don't realize how useful it can be in this profession and using it as a tool rather than something that has maybe historically been traumatizing for them.
Yes, people will say, I'm an empath. And I say, well, that's great because I feel like many of us have that ability. We have to be careful not to attach to it because a lot of times we feel it and then we go right down and we meet them there. So, what I try to do is detach from it. I feel it and I understand it, but I also have to objectively understand what it's about, not necessarily feel it and then sort of go in at that level and experience guilt with them or worry or anxiety, and which can be really tough.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up because that is also what I hear a lot from a lot of the clinicians that I supervise or who are in some of the trainings and just with colleagues is that exactly that. They become so burned out and overwhelmed because they take all of that on and they don't
Mhm.
necessarily know what is theirs versus what is the client's versus what's happening in the field. Can you say a little bit more about how you develop that skill to be able to detach from it?
Probably my best coping mechanism is when I'm not working, I spend a lot of time with exercise. I go for acupuncture, I go for massage. I make time for that because if I don't do that, I tend to unravel very quickly. So clients tend to get the best of me. I get really overwhelmed and frustrated. So I'm always noticing how I'm acting and then also putting together what do I need? Because
Mm.
it's something I'm either doing or not doing that's causing that. All of a sudden, I'm really frustrated and I'm annoyed and so forth. So for me, self-care is really important. It was too when I was a critical care nurse.
Yeah, we talk a lot about self-care in our field, but we don't always talk about how to do it. And we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to perform, and then self-care has the potential to become just another performance. I hear that a lot. Like, I go to yoga, I do my meditation, I go to, and it's like the listing all these things off, but the energy behind doing those things is I should, I have to check off the boxes. It creates actually more hypervigilance versus compassion.
Yes. So it's more forced. It's like I have to do this. But for me, when I first went into practice, when I was back into nursing, I realized that most of the nurses and doctors were the unhealthiest people I'd ever met. And then
Yeah.
when I went into psychology, I'm like, wow, a lot of these therapists are probably the most psychologically unhealthiest people I've ever met. And so I really wanted to like walk the walk. I didn't want to just say, you should do this, you should do that. I don't do it, but you should.
Hmm.
And I really hold myself accountable for that because I want people to know I talk about that in healing your body by mastering your mind. I wanted them to know that we struggle too, and we also have things that we have to overcome, and it's not easy, and we get help. We certainly get help, and that's okay. Because I wanted people to understand that we're all connected in that way. We all need help. We all suffer, and we all struggle.
Yeah, we're all human.
We are.
Yeah, it's a big shift from the days of, Sigmund Freud in the chair being
Mhm.
the all-knowing and the patient on the couch just totally vulnerable and just sharing their deepest, darkest. It's a very different approach. And the relationship is so important, and the safety in the room is so important for healing. And we can't do that if we're not being real and authentic.
That's true. I tell people all the time, you can't give what you don't have.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I love
Mhm.
that. So, what has your work taught you about the intelligence of the body?
Well, my first year into practice, I was still an intern. I did not want to do addiction. I was like, anything but addiction, anything but addiction. Of course, I got placed to do addiction. And I realized it was so helpful for me because I realized that eventually the body's going to need ease with whatever the mind tells it. And I could see how once the mind gets attached to alcohol or marijuana or so forth, it's with a strong connection that it's very difficult to break. And so I realized when I go into practice privately, I really have to help people understand that eventually the body's going to need ease. And this is important to realize, like, how much are you drinking at night? How much are you spending on the internet? How much are you doing? And to really help shift that, because once the mind gets in charge, we're probably in trouble. The mind doesn't like to suffer, and the mind wants something quick.
Yeah, I was going to say, can you say more about that? And that's so right on. So let's just reiterate that. Once the mind gets in charge, you're probably going to suffer, right? Is that what you said?
Yes.
Say that
Well,
right?
what happens when the mind will get activated or will become very hypervigilant when it's uncomfortable. And again, that situation can be real or imagined. And then what happens, because it doesn't really know how to fix it, we just goes round and round and we overthink and then we make things up because we're trying to protect ourselves. And the body again will start to really stress. Eventually, the body says, listen, I can't do it anymore. So then the mind goes, okay, we'll get something quick. Let's go to the refrigerator or let's go do something. But we also have something called an inner knowing, which is our smarter self that we rarely listen to because, particularly when the mind's involved, that'll say, you know what, maybe you should get some rest tonight, or maybe you should leave the laundry for tomorrow. It's hard because the mind is so powerful. The mind's like, nope, need something now, and I don't want to suffer anymore. But the inner knowing, and this is more when we talked about before about intuition, that is the wise part of us.
Yep. And I was going to follow up with asking for you to clarify a little bit more for folks who are listening, the difference between the mind
Mhm.
and the inner knowing. Because a lot of times people think that's the same thing. Like, well, if my mind's saying that, then it must be true.
Yes, and an easy way to decipher which one you're in, the mind is fearful, and the inner knowing is more love. Like if you would think of what you would imagine a godly love to be, forgiveness, compassion, understanding, it comes from a higher vibrational frequency, and it's more of love and feeling at peace.
I love that distinction. And I think it's really important to even repeat because I know even for myself, I've got a lot of clients who struggle with the difference. Like, well, my intuition is telling me that I have to do this. And I was like, wait a minute, your intuition does not scream.
No.
It's the ego mind or however we want to name it that is screaming. Your intuition is quiet and soft and caring and compassionate. And
Yes.
for some folks, it's really hard. That's part of the work. It's really hard to start to decipher the difference between the two.
Hmm. The mind is fearful. So, sort of a lower vibrational frequency would be depression and shame, and you're there because you barely have any energy. Then the body will start to climb. We get into guilt and anxiety and grief. And all of a sudden, we go into what I call the danger zone: anger, jealousy, ego. And this is when we're likely going to get in trouble because we're going to say or do something we shouldn't. But just a little bit above ego, if we can get there, is neutrality. And in our workplace, when somebody's really given it to us, we try to get them to at least become neutral. Like, okay, well, why don't you explain to me what's happening? And so we try to get them just to go a little bit higher so that we can calm down.
Mm.
We're really good about doing it at work, not so good about doing it at home with our partners and families.
Yeah, that's so true. And part of that is those are people who are a little bit safer. And so there's a little
Mhm.
bit more room to go there, but also it can be really damaging to those relationships.
Yeah, people will ask me all the time, how do I get from my ego to this place of neutrality? And I say, well, you're going to have to get over yourself, which
Yeah.
is really hard to do because once you get into the ego, you've got your hands on your hips and you're not going to get over yourself very easily. But it's
Yeah.
really important that you try to get to that mind space where you can just sort of calm down and get to a neutral space. But it can be tough, as we know.
Yeah. What are some ways in which you tell people to do that?
It can be hard because again, these energies are so intense. It's been building because we've had a stressful week. It's been building. And so what we really have to learn how to do is regulate our emotions.
Mm.
If we've grown up in a very chaotic home and maybe our relationship with our partner is chaotic, that becomes how we attach. So we just start fighting and bickering and so forth, and that becomes our dynamic. As you become more spiritual, you realize that this is something that I have to work through, and you learn to recognize it as it's building. So when I get into those sort of intense emotions, I try to separate from it and I try to objectively say, okay, what do you need? Other than saying something nasty or it can be tough. If I don't do my self-care, I have a really hard time. If I've done a lot of self-care, I seem to be able to get through that with a little bit more ease.
Yeah, that makes so much sense because, again, when we bring self-care into our lives, we create more capacity. And when we have more capacity, we have a greater ability to be able to recognize when we're moving into those lower vibration
Mhm.
energies and can slow it down, pause, take care of ourselves in that moment in order to access that inner knowing.
Mhm.
And I'm thinking about, as you're saying that, going back to what you said earlier in terms of how life's challenges can often be spiritual signs for learning and growth, that these relational patterns that we learn early on are often spiritual lessons for us to work through and overcome. And if we can change our mindset to look at it from that perspective in terms of what can I learn from this versus this is a defect of mine, or why does this always happen to me, or we can easily fall into despair or depression around some of these things. That if we look at it from the perspective of, okay, this is a pattern that I fall into often. I don't want to fall into it often anymore. What do I need to learn from it? And how can I stop myself before I get to that point? Because, like you said, once you're there, it's really hard to come back down unless you complete the cycle.
It really is. And a lot of times with our traumas, we become very comfortable with them. And because my trauma, I'll say, well, what did you learn? What lessons? Did you learn compassion? Did you learn empathy? Like, what did you learn? Because there are lessons. It's the only way really that we learn is through some sort of suffering, which of course the mind doesn't like that at all. But it's very important. So when things are happening to me, I try to get some space and I go, okay, what is the universe trying to teach me? I think I mastered that. Apparently, I have not because I'm experiencing it again. Because we have free will. So when we don't want to learn it, it just comes back in a different way. So we get another chance. And I try to understand that, just hold it. It's not comfortable, but it's not dangerous either.
And that is so important, right? That discomfort does not always equal danger.
It
And
doesn't.
yeah, being able to discern between those two is super important because oftentimes we interpret it as dangerous and therefore don't lean into it. And we miss the opportunity to learn and thus heal whatever it is that needs to be addressed. Yeah. So we're starting to get close to time. I want to just check in and see, is there anything that we haven't talked about so far that you want to share with the community?
One of the things I'd like everyone to just hear from me is when there's some sort of physical pain, whether it's an ache or a pain or an ailment, we don't hesitate to go to the doctor. We know that that's a warning sign, that that's something that we need to address. We usually will make time for that. But what I would like listeners to recognize is anxiety and shame and depression and anger. These are also warning signs. The nervous system is out of balance. And instead of learning to live through them or pushing through them, it's important to recognize that this is the body giving us a sign or a signal. And it's really important that we get help.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that because a lot of times people think that mental health challenges, emotional challenges don't deserve the same amount of attention that a physical ailment might. I go back to this like I'm canceling mental health because of the stigma that's around that, and knowing that even these emotional states can be a sign that there's something more happening. And what we're learning now with all the new research and science that's coming out, which I can never say, psychoneuroimmunology. I don't know if I pronounced that right. I can never get that out of my mouth. But it's such a fascinating field as we're starting to really understand how inflammation in the body and in the brain can affect our emotional health, and how psychiatric symptoms are often a warning sign that there is something happening in the body. And we often stop getting any kind of help because we've been taught that, like, oh, it's just all in your head. So I think that's super important. So taking care of ourselves and self-care on all those different levels, right? So
Mhm.
emotional health, social health, physical health, and of course, spiritual and energetic health as well.
Yes. And once the body gets sick, we go and we treat the symptom, but yet we haven't really addressed the nervous system. So it becomes that when we get to the hospital and they give us an antibiotic or whatever they give us, we still haven't corrected the problem.
Absolutely. I love that you said that. That's a big underpinning of my work, right? Is looking at the nervous system as kind
Mhm.
of like that's where everything gets driven from, right? Our nervous system is driving our bus. And if we're not looking at that and we're not addressing what's happening there, we can get stuck in those locked loops, which then creates symptoms as a way of trying to keep us safe, but just keeps us stuck in suffering unnecessarily.
Mhm. I can meet somebody and they can tell me something that they struggle with physically, and I can just stop right there and tell them what they struggle with mental health wise.
Mm.
And they get a little bit unnerved by it, but all I'm doing is understanding how the body is manifesting. The body's manifesting the breast cancer, but the energies and the emotions behind all that. And they'll often say, like, how did you know that? But it's just, again, understanding how the body works.
Absolutely. And I love all of those connections that you just intuitively make. If people want to learn more about your practice or what you do, how can they get in contact with you?
I would love for viewers to connect with me at deniseschonwald.com. As a gift today, I'll be happy to send them one of my books, whether it's Elephants Don't Marry Giraffes or Healing Your Body by Mastering Your Mind. So I'd love to hear from people. I hear from people all over the world, actually, which is fantastic.
That's amazing. Okay, so if people emailed you, let's say, and
Mhm.
said, I listened to your interview on the Spiritually Curious podcast,
Yes.
you would then be willing to send them one of your two books.
Yeah. Well, I have five. So what I
Oh,
usually
five.
do,
Oh, I
yeah. So I usually say you can look at my website or you can even look at Amazon. Pick one that you really would like. I'd be happy to mail you one as my gift to you.
that is so generous. Okay, so tell us the names of the other three.
Okay, so I have three adult books. Obviously, Healing Your Body by Mastering Your Mind.
Mhm.
Elephants Don't Marry Giraffes is about relationships.
Yep.
Insightful Self Therapy. I took 22 topics that people asked me about and just wrote a daily understanding of what it is and what you can do for it and so forth. I have two children's books. One is Getting Back to Happy. It's a little girl that was struggling with anxiety and how she worked through that with a counselor. And the other one is When Mom and Dad Divorced. It's about a little boy and his sister who got caught in the middle of his very contentious parents' divorce and working with a family mediator, which that was me.
Awesome, awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and all of the work that you're doing out there in the world. You're doing amazing things and just really happy to hear about it and understand how all these different systems work together and how important it is as helpers and healers in particular to really look at everything from this holistic perspective.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me on your show.
Of course.